The fastest way to confuse an avoidant isn't disappearing, it's becoming emotionally unavailable while still grounded. Avoidants are conditioned to expect a very specific sequence after they hurt someone: emotional pursuit, repeated explanations, visible pain, or a collapse into insecurity. Their nervous system is familiar with that pattern, and familiarity feels like control. So when you remove emotional access without removing yourself, the entire system destabilizes. You're still polite, still calm, still human, but you're no longer offering your inner world for analysis, reassurance, or emotional regulation. There are no long messages trying to be understood, no emotional processing sessions on demand, no subtle bids for validation. What replaces all of that is quiet steadiness. And for an avoidant, that's deeply confusing because it doesn't fit any of their learned categories. This is where most people get it wrong. They think power comes from vanishing completely or becoming cold and punishing. But avoidants understand disappearance. It confirms their belief that closeness equals loss or chaos. What they don't understand is emotional unavailability paired with presence. You still show up in shared spaces, you still communicate when necessary. You're not hostile, sarcastic, or dramatic, yet something essential is missing: access to your emotional core, and that absence creates psychological dissonance. Their system keeps reaching for the familiar cues: hurt, explanation, intensity, and they're met with nothing to grab onto. For an avoidant, emotional access is how they unconsciously track their impact and relevance. When you are open, expressive, or reactive, they could feel where they stood with you without having to engage deeply. When that access disappears, they lose their internal compass. They can't tell if you're hurt, detached, healed, or done. And because avoidants rely on distance to regulate themselves, not knowing where they stand creates low-level threat. It's not dramatic panic, it's a quiet unease that sits in the background and refuses to resolve. What makes this especially destabilizing is that you're not punishing them, you're not demanding accountability, you're not pushing for repair, you're simply no longer emotionally available for consumption. That forces the avoidant to confront something they rarely do: their own internal experience. Without your emotions to focus on, distract from, or manage indirectly, their attention turns inward, and that's uncomfortable. Avoidants are experts at managing relationships externally, but much less skilled at sitting with internal emotional ambiguity. This shift also breaks the power dynamic they've grown accustomed to. When emotional access was available, they held the ability to step closer or pull away without consequence. Now, closeness doesn't guarantee access, and distance doesn't provoke pursuit. The usual levers don't work. They may test the system: subtle reach outs, casual messages, neutral check ins, not necessarily to reconnect, but to see if access is still there. When they discover it isn't, yet you're still grounded and self directed, confusion deepens. The key is that this isn't a strategy you perform, it's a state you inhabit. You're not withholding to provoke. You're unavailable because you're no longer orienting your nervous system around theirs. Your energy is self-contained. You respond, but you don't open. You engage, but you don't explain. You remain respectful without being emotionally porous. That combination sends a signal their system doesn't know how to decode: safety without access, presence without pursuit, connection without emotional exposure. And that's why this works. Not because it manipulates them into coming closer, but because it removes the familiar script entirely. Avoidance feels safest when they understand the emotional terrain, even if that terrain is distant. When the map disappears, they're left with a question they didn't expect to ask: what changed? And more importantly, why does it feel different this time? Nothing confuses an avoidant more than someone who stays regulated when they expected chaos. Avoidants don't fear emotion itself. They fear emotional unpredictability. What their nervous system is trained to anticipate after they hurt someone is intensity-raised voices, long emotional messages, spiraling questions, urgency, or emotional collapse. Even when they say they can't handle drama, that emotional surge is familiar territory. Familiar equals manageable. So when you respond to pain with regulation instead of reaction, their system short circuits. The threat response they prepared for never arrives, and without it, they don't know how to orient themselves in the interaction. Regulation doesn't mean suppression. It means your emotions exist, but they're contained within you rather than spilling outward for someone else to manage, soothe, or escape from. You speak clearly. You don't rush to resolve. You don't argue your reality into existence. Your tone stays steady. Your words are minimal, but intentional. And most importantly, there's no emotional urgency underneath your response. That absence of urgency is what creates confusion, because urgency is what allowed the avoidant to justify distance in the past. When an avoidant hurts you, part of them unconsciously expects the emotional explosion to confirm their internal narrative. See, this is why closeness is dangerous. A regulated response denies them that confirmation. Instead of chaos, they're met with calm. Instead of volatility, they encounter grounded presence. This forces their nervous system to reevaluate the situation in real time. The threat they were bracing against doesn't exist, yet the discomfort remains. And discomfort without a clear external cause is deeply unsettling for someone who avoids internal processing. This is where the confusion deepens. They can't label you as too emotional, but they also can't read you as disengaged or cold. You're not escalating, but you're not chasing either. You acknowledge what happened without dramatizing it. You don't beg for repair, yet you don't pretend it didn't matter. This balanced state removes their usual escape routes. There's nothing to react against, nothing to push away, nothing to blame. They're left facing the quiet reality of their own behavior without emotional noise to drown it out. Avoidants are often most comfortable when the emotional responsibility stays external. When someone reacts strongly, the avoidant can focus on managing distance rather than reflecting inward. Regulation flips that dynamic. Your calm response subtly returns responsibility to them, not through accusation, but through contrast. The absence of reaction highlights the weight of the action itself. And because you're not demanding accountability, they're more likely to feel it internally rather than resist it defensively. Another reason this is so powerful is that regulated energy signals self-trust. You're not scrambling to be understood. You're not proving your worth through emotional expression. You're not trying to control the outcome. That communicates something avoidants aren't used to encountering emotional strength without pressure. It destabilizes the relational hierarchy where one person reacts and the other withdraws. Now, there's no pursuer and no runner, just a grounded presence that refuses to play the old roles. This doesn't mean they'll immediately move closer. In fact, it often creates a pause. Avoidance may pull back slightly, not because they don't care, but because their system is recalibrating. Something feels different, and they need space to process it. The key difference is that this space isn't powered by relief, it's powered by uncertainty, and uncertainty keeps the connection psychologically alive. By responding with regulation instead of reaction, you're no longer feeding the avoidance nervous system the patterns it recognizes. You're introducing a new relational experience. Emotional safety without emotional pursuit. And once an avoidant feels that difference, even unconsciously the old dynamics can't fully reassemble. The confusion isn't accidental, it's the byproduct of growth, clarity, and emotional self-containment. An avoidance power collapses the moment you stop asking them to explain themselves. Avoidants don't usually hold power because they are confident or emotionally certain. They hold it because they stay undefined. Ambiguity is their safest position. It allows them to receive connection without obligation, closeness without accountability, and hence without commitment. When you repeatedly seek clarity, asking what you are, where things are going, or why something happened, you unknowingly step into a role that stabilizes their nervous system. Your questions give shape to the space they prefer to keep blurry, and in doing so, you carry the emotional weight they're avoiding. The moment you stop asking those questions, the dynamic shifts, not because you've become distant or cold, but because you've exited a psychological loop they rely on. Avoidants are accustomed to others doing the emotional labor of defining the relationship, naming the rupture, and pushing toward resolution. That effort allows them to remain passive while still benefiting from connection. When the questions disappear, the structure collapses. There's no longer a clear script for them to follow, and that lack of structure creates internal tension they can't externalize. Silence from you hits differently than distance ever could. Distance confirms their belief that people leave when things get uncomfortable. Silence, on the other hand, removes their reference point. You're not demanding answers, but you're not offering reassurance either. You're simply no longer participating in the fog that forces the unresolved tension back onto them. The questions that once lived in your mind now echo in theirs, and because avoidants are uncomfortable sitting with emotional uncertainty, that role reversal is deeply destabilizing. This is where their sense of control begins to erode. Control for an avoidant isn't dominance, it's predictability, as long as they know you'll eventually ask, explain, or push. For clarity, they can manage the distance. When you stop seeking explanations, they lose that predictability. They don't know whether you've accepted the situation, emotionally detached, or quietly moved on. And because you're not pressing for answers, they can't soothe themselves by staying vague. The ambiguity they once relied on now works against them. Importantly, this isn't about playing games or withholding communication to provoke a response. It's about recognizing that clarity cannot come from someone who is invested in remaining unclear. Every time you ask an avoidant to explain themselves before they're ready or capable, you reinforce the imbalance. You become the one holding emotional urgency, while they remain insulated from it. When you stop, you reclaim your energy and shift the responsibility back to where it belongs.
Avoidants often interpret the absence of questions as emotional withdrawal, but it's not withdrawal, it's self-containment. You're no longer outsourcing your emotional stability to their words or decisions. You're no longer waiting for them to define what they themselves are unsure about. That quiet self-direction is unsettling for them because it removes their ability to control the emotional pace of the connection without having to engage.
Over time, this creates a subtle but powerful internal reckoning. Without your pursuit of clarity, avoidants are left alone with their own contradictions. They can't rely on vagueness to maintain closeness if no one is asking for more. They may feel a strange pull to re-engage, not out of sudden emotional availability, but out of discomfort with the unresolved space. The silence becomes louder than any question you could have asked. Stepping out of the fog doesn't mean you accept mistreatment or confusion. It means you refuse to live inside uncertainty that isn't yours to resolve. You didn't push, you didn't pull, you simply stopped chasing clarity from someone who survives by withholding it. And in that stillness, the power dynamic shifts. Not because you demanded change, but because you no longer participated in what kept them comfortable. You don't punish an avoidant by pulling away. You confuse them by matching behavior without emotional charge. Most people believe the only way to respond to distance is with either protest or punishment. They either chase harder or withdraw dramatically. Avoidants understand both of those moves. Chasing confirms importance, and dramatic withdrawal confirms threat. What they don't understand is neutrality. Matching energy without mirroring emotion removes the emotional feedback they rely on to regulate the connection. It's not coldness, and it's not passive aggression. It's alignment without charge. And that distinction is what destabilizes their internal script. When an avoidant reduces effort, shorter replies, less initiation, more space, the instinctive reaction is emotional mirroring. Hurt shows up as hurt. Distance becomes distance layered with resentment. Silence becomes silence filled with meaning. That emotional overlay is exactly what the avoidant expects. It gives them something to respond to, defend against, or escape from. But when you reduce availability calmly, without explanation or attitude, the familiar emotional rhythm disappears. You're no longer reacting, you're simply adjusting. Neutral matching communicates something powerful at a nervous system level. You're responsive to reality, not to emotion. You don't argue with their behavior and you don't internalize it either. You adapt without commentary. This is deeply unsettling for avoidance because it removes their ability to frame the situation as emotional conflict. There's no fight, no pursuit, no visible pain, just a quiet recalibration that reflects their actions back to them without judgment. Avoidants often rely on emotional mirroring to maintain distance without guilt. If you react emotionally, they can justify withdrawal by focusing on your reaction instead of their behavior. Neutrality removes that distraction. Now, when they pull back, they feel the absence of connection without the relief of emotional chaos. The space they created is suddenly quieter than expected, and that silence draws attention inward rather than outward. This is where confusion sets in. They may notice you're less available, but can't label it as rejection. You didn't announce a boundary, you didn't make a statement, you simply stopped offering more than was being reciprocated. That subtle shift forces them to confront a reality they often avoid. Relationships are reciprocal ecosystems. When effort drops on one side, the system naturally rebalances. Seeing that balance happen without emotional friction disrupts their sense of control. Matching energy without emotion also signals emotional maturity. You're not trying to teach them a lesson or provoke a response. You're respecting your own bandwidth. That self-respect is disorienting for someone used to managing closeness through avoidance. They're accustomed to partners over-functioning emotionally to keep the connection alive. When that stops, the relationship no longer runs on borrowed energy. The discomfort this creates is quiet but persistent. Avoidants are skilled at managing overt conflict, but less skilled at sitting with subtle imbalance. When there's no emotional drama to react to, they're left alone with the question of why the connection feels different. That discomfort doesn't always lead to immediate action, but it does initiate self-awareness. And self-awareness is something avoidants rarely access through confrontation. It's important to understand that this approach isn't about control, it's about congruence. You're aligning your availability with what's actually happening rather than what you hope will happen. That alignment restores your internal equilibrium and removes the emotional labor of maintaining closeness single-handedly. From the avoidance perspective, the relationship no longer feels predictable. The usual patterns don't produce the same outcomes, and that unpredictability creates confusion. Over time, this dynamic reveals something essential. Avoidants don't respond to pressure, but they do respond to shifts in relational energy that feel natural and unforced. When you stop mirroring emotion and start mirroring reality, you change the entire field of interaction. They're no longer reacting to your feelings, they're facing their own behavior reflected back without distortion. And that mirror free of emotional charge is far more confronting than any argument could ever be. An avoidant doesn't miss words, they miss access. Avoidants are rarely impacted by declarations, speeches, or emotional explanations. In fact, dramatic boundary announcements often activate their defense systems and push them further into withdrawal. What reaches them instead is experience. When you let them feel your absence without announcing it, you remove the performance aspect of disconnection and allow the nervous system to register change organically. You don't need to explain what you're doing or why. You simply stop offering what was once freely available, and that quiet withdrawal speaks louder than any conversation ever could. This absence isn't about disappearing completely. It's about withdrawing specific forms of access that once made the connection comfortable for them. Emotional reassurance. Immediate replies, being the one who checks in, smooths over tension, or carries the relational load. When those elements are removed, the environment subtly changes. At first, avoidants often don't notice. Their system interprets the reduced intensity as relief. Less emotional input feels easier, calmer, safer. But that initial calm is deceptive. Avoidants don't register loss in the moment because their nervous system is oriented toward avoiding threat, not tracking connection. The recognition comes later, when things slow down, when there's no message waiting, no emotional availability on standby, no sense of being held in someone else's attention. That's when the absence becomes felt, not as drama, but as quiet disorientation. Something familiar is missing, and they can't immediately name what it is. This delayed recognition is what creates confusion. You didn't warn them, you didn't negotiate, you didn't ask for permission. You simply stopped offering access that was never guaranteed to begin with. And because avoidants often rely on that access without consciously acknowledging it, its absence creates an internal imbalance. The relationship no longer feels the same, yet there was no rupture to blame it on. That lack of a clear cause forces reflection inward rather than outward. What makes this especially powerful is that you're not framing your absence as a consequence. You're not saying, because you did this, I'm doing that. There's no moral high ground or emotional ultimatum. The shift happens quietly, almost invisibly. From the avoidance perspective, you haven't become hostile or demanding. You've simply become less accessible, and that change challenges their assumption that emotional labor will always be available regardless of their level of engagement. Avoidants often assume that connection is stable as long as there's no overt conflict. When you stop providing reassurance and relational effort, that assumption collapses. They begin to feel the subtle weight of what they once received without having to ask for it. This is when questions start forming internally, not necessarily about commitment, but about presence. Why does it feel quieter? Why does this feel different? Those questions arise precisely because nothing was announced. Letting them feel your absence without explanation also preserves your dignity and emotional autonomy. You're not just setting boundaries, you're embodying them. You're no longer over-functioning to keep the connection alive. You're allowing the relationship to reflect reality rather than intention. And that alignment reduces your emotional exhaustion while increasing their awareness of the relational dynamic. Over time, this absence can become louder than any confrontation. Avoidants are highly sensitive to shifts in relational energy, even if they don't articulate it. When access is removed without drama, they're left alone with the impact of their behavior. There's no emotional explosion to distract from it, no argument to focus on, no explanation to debate, just the felt sense of something missing. This is where internal reflection begins. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped buffering them from the consequences of emotional distance. They miss access, not words. And when access is gone quietly, the confusion that follows isn't destabilizing in a chaotic way. It's clarifying. It invites awareness, not through pressure, but through absence that finally has room to be felt. The moment your life stops orbiting them, the power dynamic silently flips. Avoidants often feel most secure when they are the emotional center of a connection, without having to carry the weight of responsibility. As long as they sense that someone's attention, mood, and direction are subtly organized around them, they can regulate closeness and distance on their own terms. This doesn't always happen consciously. It's a nervous system dynamic where knowing someone is emotionally oriented toward them creates a sense of safety, even if they rarely move closer. When your life stops orbiting them, that quiet sense of control disappears. Maintaining self-direction means your energy is anchored in your own life rather than the relationship. Your routines aren't adjusted around their availability. Your mood isn't contingent on their messages. Your sense of momentum doesn't stall when they pull back. This shift isn't announced or explained, it's embodied. And because it happens without confrontation, it's far more disorienting for an avoidant than any directed challenge ever could be. What makes this especially powerful is that you don't broadcast the change. There's no need to prove you're doing well or showcase your independence. Avoidants are sensitive to performative autonomy and can dismiss it as reactionary. But when self-direction is quiet and consistent, it registers differently. You're not trying to be seen. You're simply living. That absence of signaling removes their subconscious leverage, the unspoken assumption that you're emotionally available on standby. Avoidants often rely on the knowledge that someone is waiting, even if that person isn't actively pursuing. Waiting creates a psychological safety net. It means they can take space without risking loss. When that waiting energy disappears, something feels off. They can't point to a specific behavior, but the connection no longer feels anchored the same way. You're still present, still cordial, still grounded, but you're no longer oriented around them. This creates a subtle imbalance. They struggle to name. There's no conflict to resolve, no emotional crisis to respond to. Just a quiet realization that they're no longer the gravitational center. That realization can trigger discomfort, not because they suddenly want closeness, but because the familiar dynamic has shifted. The system they relied on to feel safe has changed without their input. Self-direction also alters how interactions feel. Conversations become lighter, shorter, more neutral. You're no longer reaching out to fill space or maintain connection. You engage when it aligns with your life, not when it soothes anxiety. This signals emotional sovereignty. You're not withholding, you're simply unavailable for orbiting, and that distinction matters. Avoidants aren't threatened by independence, they're unsettled by independence that doesn't need their approval. Over time, this shift can provoke reflection. Without someone emotionally centering them, Avoidants are left to notice their own role in the dynamic. They may feel a pull to reassert relevance, not necessarily through intimacy, but through fluid bids for attention. These bids often come disguised as casual check-ins or neutral messages. They're not always about reconnection. They're about recalibrating the power balance. The key is that you don't respond by reorbiting. You remain self-directed. You respond when appropriate, but you don't reorganize your life around the interaction. This consistency reinforces the new dynamic. The avoidant learns at a nervous system level that access to you is no longer guaranteed by distance alone. Waiting no longer keeps the connection intact. Maintaining self-direction isn't about proving your worth or creating jealousy. It's about reclaiming your center of gravity. When your life is full, structured, and meaningful without reference to them, the relational field changes. The power dynamic flips not because you demanded it, but because you stopped orienting your world around someone who never intended to carry that responsibility. And that quiet shift is often the most confronting experience an avoidant can have. The most disorienting thing for an avoidant is being left alone with their feelings. Avoidants are rarely comfortable sitting inside their own emotional experience for long. Over time, many of them unconsciously rely on partners to carry emotional weight on their behalf, processing what happened, naming feelings, soothing tension, translating conflict into manageable. This doesn't mean they're incapable of emotion. It means they've learned to externalize emotional labor as a way to stay regulated. When you stop doing that work for them, their internal world grows louder, and that sudden volume is deeply unsettling. Leaving them with their own experience isn't an act of punishment or withdrawal. It's a quiet refusal to continue buffering discomfort that doesn't belong to you. You don't attack. You don't demand explanations or apologies. You don't overinterpret their behavior or soften the emotional impact for them. You simply allow reality to land where it should. And because avoidants are used to someone else absorbing or organizing the emotional consequences of their actions, this shift creates confusion before it creates awareness. In the past, emotional moments may have unfolded in a predictable way. You felt something, you expressed it, you tried to resolve it, they listened partially, withdrew, or minimized. The emotional loop closed because you carried the weight forward. When you stop, the loop stays open. There's no resolution handed to them, no emotional narrative to hide behind, just a feeling they can't outsource. That open loop is uncomfortable because it forces internal engagement rather than external avoidance. Avoidants often feel safest when emotions are managed indirectly. If someone else is explaining, soothing, or forgiving, they can remain slightly detached while still benefiting from connection. When that stops, they're left alone with sensations. They're not practiced at tolerating guilt, regret, longing, or unease. These feelings don't always show up immediately. Sometimes they surface later in quiet moments when distraction fades. That delayed emotional contact is what makes this so disorienting. What's important here is that you're not withholding compassion, you're withholding over-functioning. You're no longer translating your pain into something palatable for them. You're no longer reassuring them that everything is okay when it isn't. You're no longer rushing to restore emotional equilibrium. This isn't cruelty, it's emotional accuracy. And emotional accuracy disrupts avoidance far more effectively than confrontation ever could. When avoidants are left with their own experience, they may initially feel confused rather than remorseful. Confusion comes from the absence of familiar emotional cues. They expect you to step in, smooth things over, or carry the discomfort forward. When you don't, they're left wondering why the emotional atmosphere feels heavier. There's no argument to focus on, no emotional outburst to blame, just an internal sensation that something is unresolved. Over time, this confusion can turn into awareness, not because you demanded accountability, but because the emotional consequences are no longer buffered. They begin to sense the weight of their actions without someone else absorbing it. That awareness doesn't always lead to immediate change, but it does plant a seed. It introduces the idea that emotional distance has a cost, and that cost is internal rather than external. Stepping aside in this way also restores your own emotional balance. You're no longer managing someone else's comfort at the expense of your own clarity. You allow yourself to feel without performing that feeling for someone else's benefit. This creates a grounded presence that isn't reactive or detached, but but self-contained. And that self-containment is unfamiliar terrain for an avoidant. Leaving them with their own experience isn't about teaching a lesson, it's about ending a pattern where you carried what they avoided. When you step aside, the confusion they feel isn't manipulative. It's natural. It's the result of finally encountering their own emotional reality without a buffer. And in that space, awareness becomes possible, not because you forced it, but because you stopped preventing it.